case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, welcome Sublation media viewers. It's I, Douglas Lane, on the Sublation Magazine show. I'm the author of the novella Wave of Mutilation, which is what I thought we might be anticipating today, as Trump had made this ultimatum. But turns out that isn't the case. With me is Benjamin Studebaker. Ben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Yeah, what I had anticipated, Ben, was that we would be starting this stream about 15 minutes before the 48-hour deadline was about to be up, and then we'd watch, maybe turn on some sort of live feed on YouTube, CNN or Fox News or something, to watch as the bombs dropped and the lights turned out in Iran, then wait for the reprisal, the retaliation from Iran as they launched whatever missiles and drones they could at Qatar or the UAE or Saudi Arabia, just wiping out oil supplies and desalination facilities. But luckily for us, overnight, Trump got a great, perfect phone call from someone in Iran, who knows who.
Speaker. It's the parliament speaker.
Are we sure about that?
That's the report. The report is that it's the speaker of the parliament.
Mm-hmm. But now, how do we know that? I mean, I've seen that on Twitter, but who did Trump say that? Who has been saying who it was?
Somebody's suggested it to the media, such that the media is reporting that this is who it ostensibly is. Of course, it might not be this person. It might be multiple people. It might not be anybody. It might be a verbal gambit or a way of trying to get out of having to go through with what was promised.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's walk through the scenarios of what could have happened, where we might be. Let's start with the assumption that I think everyone on the left is making right now, which is that Trump lied. He threw a tantrum, made this threat, but then at the last moment invented a reason to delay. Let's just throw in that some of his friends knew what he was going to do in advance, made put some puts on the market, or made some last minute adjustments so they could benefit from the rally that would happen in the stock market when he made his announcement. And basically there's nothing behind Trump's claim that they're entering into negotiations with Iran. Where would that leave us right now, do you think, Ben?
Well, if there was nothing to the claim, I think the point of the claim would then be to sow distrust within the regime. If there was nothing to the claim, then the function of the claim would be to try to encourage people in the regime to not trust each other and think that somebody's talking to the Americans. And if there are reports that specific people are talking to the Americans, like this speaker guy, he can deny it, but there will be suspicion of him because there are media reports that are fingering him as somebody who is talking. Now, it might be a way of trying to speak it into being or hyperstition it, because once the military doesn't trust this person, the hardline elements of the military, then this pushes that person to try to find allies who can protect them from a potential purge that might come from a military that's concerned about traitors in its midst. So I think there may be something like that going on. I think also we have to bear in mind the context of the recent reports that say that even according to the intelligence services, we don't know who's in charge of Iran right now. If we don't know who's in charge of Iran right now, the reports are that the new supreme leader is not meeting with people, and that while there are orders that are being issued, they're not coming from the supreme leader. So that implies that the supreme leader is not actually the person running the country, which, if that's true, that implies that on some level regime change has already occurred, because it's no longer a regime which is led by a supreme leader who is an Islamic figure. It's a regime that's being led in some way, shape, or form by the guard or by military elements. So it's become a military junta de facto, if that's the case. Now, if it's a military junta, then the question is it a group of guys who are making the decisions together collectively? Or is there somebody in particular who matters? Well, if it's a group of guys who are making the decisions collectively so that no one of them can be taken out through an assassination plot, then there's the possibility of sowing mistrust among those guys. So the different ways that you can try to harden a regime, one is to have a very clear line of secession. The issue with the very clear line of secession is that you know what order the line is in. So you can make a deal with somebody in the order, kill everybody above them in the order, and put them in charge. In Venezuela, very simple. They kill the president. They have a deal with the vice president. The vice president is next in line. So they have a way of getting what they want. In Iran, it doesn't work like that. There's no line of secession. So people go, this is an advantage for the Iranian regime. In the Iranian regime, you can't kill people to determine who the leader is. You could do that in the United States. If you wanted the Secretary of State or whoever it is to be the leader, there's an order, and you could kill everybody above that person if you were able to do that and make that person the president. We have a kind of simple, straightforward line of secession that if you had these kinds of weapons and this kind of intelligence, a foreign state could try to manipulate that. The Iranian regime tries to prevent that by having collective institutions. Now, collective institutions make it hard to determine the leader, but they also can lead to mistrust, which you could potentially generate by pitting various people against each other. So I think what the administration is trying to do is pit the various people who are possibly important against each other to try to get these people to fight each other. So that one of them can be forced to emerge as a deal maker.
This scenario holds really regardless of whether or not Trump got a call. Because even if he did get a call, he could still be attempting to pit people against each other in the way that you described, hoping that the person he's talking to can be put into power if he plays his cards right. That they don't actually have to already be in authority and be able to really deliver yet. And for this scenario to be in his mind, to be the way.
Yeah, so it's kind of a testing of these people. So if you create a situation where there's mutual fear, then somebody might try to assemble a coalition around themselves to be able to defend themselves from others in the regime that they may be concerned about. And then they might figure that a deal with the United States would be necessary to execute that, because otherwise they might feel insecure or as if their coalition is insufficiently strong. Of course, the converse also holds. You could have a situation where there is no one in the regime who's capable of making a deal with the United States and remaining in power, where the guard would throw out anybody who would do that. However, if the guard throws out anybody who would do that and begins purging internally within the regime, then the guard will become participatory in the transformation of the regime, because it will be purging various civilian elements. And so they're trying to make a deal with the parliament speaker. So they're looking to the Republican elements of the regime, which they regard as the most tractable for them. And if they can pit the guard against the Republican elements, then that forces the guard to turn the regime more and more into a military junta. And that's junta. What the function of this
junta is. According to the chat, you're supposed to say junta.
Yeah, whatever. What it is doing is it's making the regime more and more of a barracks regime, as the regime is forced to eliminate or to put into purely ceremonial positions more and more figures who previously were quite important. So this is changing and transforming the fundamental character of the regime, not necessarily in a direction that, say, liberal Democrats would like to see, but it is changing it. It's making it into a military dictatorship. And when you take an Islamic republic and you make it into a military dictatorship, it makes it into a more normal kind of regime in certain important respects, a regime that potentially you might be able to deal with.
Well, according to Gene Bazelon, who I interviewed yesterday, and I will be releasing the interview during the week, Iran was already fairly close to being run this way before, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, I think he basically does agree with you that this is who is really running Iran now, um, the military, and so right. So we're still in an uncertain situation, for sure. We don't know if who's in charge. I mean, I tend to think that we ought to at least take it to be a possibility that the Ayatollah's son is still in charge, even though we're told we haven't heard from him. We're told that the intelligence community doesn't know. We're told that he might be in Moscow.
The
Getting
regime has denied that.
Yeah, I know, but we were told all sorts of things. Is my point. So we should. It is not clear that he is not in charge. It's really just unclear as to who is in charge. But it does seem to me that the other problem is that even in, and maybe especially in the context of there not being a clear center of power in Iran, that the aim of securing the strait and even of pausing aggressive action against oil infrastructure, energy infrastructure throughout the region, both become difficult because you can have different factions deciding to act independently of one another. You don't have necessarily someone who can say, okay, we're done. This was the same in Ukraine to a degree, where Zelensky would like go and tell these ex-Nazis to stop attacking Russia, to disarm, and be told no. So there is a risk here for the possibility of a resolution to this, even as Iran fractures and falls apart.
Yeah, I'm also increasingly unsure that they really want to get the Strait of Hormuz open.
What you mean, whether Trump wants to get it open?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much the United States really cares about getting the Strait of Hormuz open. Because so much of the oil that comes through the Strait of Hormuz goes to China.
Right.
And while the Iranians have allowed some Chinese ships through, it's nothing like the normal volume of oil. People have to bear in mind, if you look at how many ships are going through, it's nothing like the normal volume. And a lot of countries that are affected by this are also trying to buy American liquefied natural gas in response. Japan, for instance, asked Trump to sell Japan Alaskan LNG.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of my old supervisors from Cambridge, Helen Thompson, did a video with Unheard where she speculated that perhaps there could be a strategy here of trying to increase energy costs for China while increasing the dependence of various allied states on North American LNG.
Mm-hmm. I saw that. I watched that.
I don't know for sure if that's the case, but it's an interesting theory. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting theory. And in particular, the allies were asked, you're the principal beneficiaries of this. Will you contribute to reopening it on a military level? And of course, the allies are not interested in doing that. And they're not interested in doing that because the cost of securing the strait, given the munitions that you'd have to use, the interceptors, is very high relative to the benefit. And then once you deplete your interceptors, you're going to have to buy more interceptors. And where will you have to buy them from if you do that? The United States. Mm-hmm. So it becomes, do you want to buy American interceptors or do you want to buy American LNG?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I'm not so sure that the strait is a priority for the administration unless it produces an economic shock of a large enough scale in the United States that it becomes a political liability for the administration heading into the midterm. And while the oil price is up to 95 to 100, it's not at 120. And when the oil price is a bit elevated, the American LNG does better because the American LNG is not very cost effective to drill when the oil price is too low.
Mm-hmm. The price of oil, crude oil now is $88 right at the moment. I just checked, and
just 88. That's a
yeah.
little lower than when I last looked.
Well, there are two different futures around oil, and this is the crude oil, and then there's the other one that's higher, is around 100.
Brent crude.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So this is 88. It's not bad, in comparison to where it was on Friday, which I think was around 98 on Friday. And
yeah, maybe it's coming down now because he said that he's going to have a 5-day long negotiation period.
No,
that might
sure.
be a factor in it coming down right this minute.
No, it definitely is. I mean, there's no question that his announcement drove down the price of oil and drove the stock market up this morning. And,
a little bit. Yeah. We'll see if that sticks, because we may come to the end of
halfway back
this
from what we lost on Friday. Was gained, maybe a little more than that was gained today. So, but no one's confident about. I'm watching these different financial podcasts, and no one's confident about. And what everyone in the financial sector is worried about is rate cuts. And up until recently, everyone was worried that there won't be rate cuts. They were hoping for 1, 2, 3 rate cuts this year. And now everyone's wondering if they should price in rate hikes, apparently. So, because inflation is a factor here. So
we don't have a good inflation report yet. We haven't seen inflation reports for the United States that include the data from the month where this has been going on yet.
Mm-hmm.
The inflation reports that came out last week were about the previous month.
Right.
So we're still trying to figure out what the economic impact is on the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, there's a period of uncertainty about the economy where there's a certain level of flexibility with regard to what they can do. If it becomes clear that the economy really is in trouble, that is going to have a very strong restraining force on the president. But if it's the case that this can be managed with a minimal level of economic disruption in the way that the Ukraine war was managed, where it's the Allied states that are principally affected, the Allied states are made more dependent on the United States, but the United States is itself insulated from most of the effects. And there's a relative gain for the United States vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis the Allies. That could be something that might not just be tolerable for the administration. It could be an objective.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the thing about what you're saying is I think Trump wants to avoid even the kinds of repercussions that the Ukraine war caused, because one of the things he can rhetorically point to is how much better off we are now in comparison to Biden's administration. And 2022 is thought of as a period of downturn. So I think Trump wants to avoid even that level of inflation and recession.
The 2022 midterm elections weren't horrific for the Democrats.
No.
If you're just thinking about it in terms of what's compatible with competing at the midterm, 2022 wasn't horrific for the Democrats. So if you're going to have a year that's like 2022, it's not obvious that that's going to be politically horrific for you.
True. I don't know to the degree to which, I mean, look, obviously what I think Trump wants to do most of all is be able to rearrange the region so that it's more beneficial to Americans' long-term interests or his trade interests, right? And so this would, and it may not even be that the midterms are that important.
They have a different region that they play this game in, but it's a similar game. With Biden, it was Ukraine and it was with the Europeans directly. And here it's Iran, it's the Gulf states, but it's the same kind of game where, I've surprised you with a big problem now that's going to cause an economic shock for you. You're going to have to come to me and hang on to me for stability because I'm the one who can control when this ends. You can't control when it ends.
Right. But
it's
Europe is not
dealing with
and the thing is, Europe is still dealing with the trouble in Ukraine.
And it weakened more so than they were economies. enormously. The Ukraine war did enormous damage to the European economies, and this war is going to do enormous damage, is doing enormous damage to the economies of the Gulf allies.
Right.
But those Gulf allies will simultaneously be stuck relying on the United States to resolve the problem, just as the Europeans are stuck relying on the United States to solve the problem in Ukraine. And then this fact that the United States has created a mess that's nearby and that the United States controls the direction of that mess becomes a leverage point with all of those states. The question is, can the American economy bear that? And a lot of people who think it's going to be like a 20th century oil shock don't recognize the degree to which the energy infrastructure of the world has changed over the last 20 years as a consequence of Barack Obama's shale oil fracking. Barack Obama changed the energy picture by drill baby drilling all over the place. While ostensibly being politically opposed to that, he drill baby drilled all over the United States and created an enormous amount of North American shale oil that has been continuously used by the United States as a chip in these conflicts. So it doesn't look anything like a 20th century situation where the United States was genuinely dependent on Gulf oil, and therefore, it was in multiple cases hamstrung by policy decisions taken outside of the territory of the United States. The Ukraine war and the Iran war are both decisions taken by the United States to permit or to Israel or Russia to launch a conflict and to escalate that conflict to the point at which it creates an energy shock. In the 70s, it was an OPEC embargo, which many of the Gulf states were participatory in. Gulf states that are now allied to the United States were formerly hostile and participated in that embargo. And then in 79, it was the case of the Iranian Revolution causing disruption to the oil price on the basis of the Gulf at a time when there was no shale oil, there was no substantial amount of American LNG. It was a totally different energy picture. So I think a lot of people don't get the energy policy side of it because they're out of date in their understanding of how the global energy infrastructure works.
Right. I agree with you there. And like I said, I listened to your mentor, Helen Thompson, and I thought what she said was quite interesting, and it was a good theory as far as it goes. But I nonetheless, I spend my days when I'm not doing more productive things, every once in a while checking in on what people are saying on Twitter. And on Twitter, I think there's, especially kind of on the left side of Twitter, and the left side of Twitter probably includes everyone from Nick Fuentes to Tucker Carlson to Glenn Greenwald to, they're all sounding alike to me now, to Kyle Kulinski, the anti-imperialist side of Twitter. They are saying that there was no negotiation with Iran. Iran is holding strong and will prevail. That now we've seen the weakness of the American empire because they can't do anything about the strait but to secure their neighbors. Israel is in tatters. They've sunk the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, or at least just put it out of commission. Our best planes are vulnerable to attack, and so forth.
One of the things that happens every time there's one of these wars is that a lot of these left-wing channels just start, doing propaganda for the armed forces of the other state. And this happened during the Ukraine war with Russia, where when the Russians came in, all of these left channels immediately declared that Russia was going to win and was going to wipe out Ukraine. These guys don't have good information. They've established over the years that they will distribute the propaganda of whoever is opposed to the United States, regardless of whether it's reliable, not reliable, based on facts, based on fake made-up stuff. These channels are not reliable for foreign policy coverage, generally.
Right, yeah. Look, with the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, apparently it had been deployed 9 months earlier and had been at sea for longer than was the norm. The crew had low morale. There was a fire in the kitchen, and they had like the worst thing, I think, the sewage system on the thing was backing up all the time. So, it was a smelly, it was like a shithole aircraft carrier that's been pushed around. So I think
one of the ways you can tell you're dealing with, retrograde people is that they're obsessed with aircraft carriers and destroyers and physical boats, big physical boats of the kind that you'd trot out in World War II. When people start talking about big dreadnoughts and aircraft carriers and focusing on elements of warfare that come from the previous generation of military strategy and tactics, we're not talking about people who understand the way contemporary wars work or the way that the contemporary world works. We're talking about people who are living in a 20th century LARP where everything works the way that they imagine it worked during the Cold War or earlier in some cases. I mean, I've heard people who say, oh, look how many artillery shells the Russians make, like it's World War I. There's all kinds of Looney Tune stuff that goes on those channels.
I'll tell you something though, Ben. If I were in the military, the last place I'd want to be, well, maybe one of the last places I'd want to be deployed is to an aircraft carrier called the Gerald Ford, because I just assume it would fall down on the job. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But I'm not convinced that by the media that's out there on the left or on the anti-imperialist side of things. But I do find it troubling that so many people that are in our milieu, or at least adjacent to it, are seemingly caught up in this this approach to understanding the conflict. And I think
one of the things that went around that I thought was kind of interesting on Twitter was somebody sending an old video of somebody putting a nuclear weapon in an artillery cannon and firing it as a 15 kiloton nuclear test. And people going, we've just agreed not to use the real weapons. Everyone just doesn't use the real weapons that people came up with. And how crazy is that? Nobody uses the real weapons that we have. And there's an element of truth to this, which is that there are, of course, big area of effect damage weapons that the United States has that would wreak enormous havoc on any country that they were dropped on. And I'm not just talking about the nuclear weapons. I'm also talking about great big conventional weapons that can be used to eliminate population centers, kill enormous numbers of people. This kind of stuff isn't used. And it's not used because it's felt that the economic and therefore political consequences of using it would be too great to withstand. The war that's going on is limited by certain political and economic constraints.
Right.
That the United States faces.
That. I mean, that's so obvious right now because everyone just flies off the handle when anything that we actually need gets hurt. What I was thinking about the other day is do you ever see, I'm sorry, my references, I know, but there's a movie called Repo Man. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but in the movie, a scientist from Los Alamos is driving across the desert in some convertible, and he has something in his trunk that's glowing, and everywhere he goes, the people will try to, the cops pull him over and they open the trunk and they evaporate. And it turns out that scientist was working on the neutron bomb, and he's been driven mad by his work because he's so ethically compromised by it. And he describes a neutron bomb in a way that's a little bit hyperbolic. It's a bomb you can drop, kills all the people, leaves everything standing. And that's what I feel like if we could build those, that's how we would fight wars. We would fight wars just with these bombs that would blow up, kill everybody, and leave all the infrastructure intact. That's where we're headed, maybe, or we were in the 70s, I think. But anyway.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who imagine that the United States is doing everything it possibly can to win that war. Obviously, the United States isn't. For one, it's not sending in a ground army because that would be political suicide to do that. It's not because the United States couldn't spend an enormous amount of money to send in a ground army, defeat the Iranian ground army, and over a period of 6 months or a year, occupy large parts of the Iranian country. It's that would be politically extremely deadly for an administration to attempt because of the electoral consequences of it. And then also because you'd have to ask Congress for an authorization of use of force and for money. So there's power of the purse elements. You'd need to get the Federal Reserve to support the spending. All of this could be done if you had a war that there was broad public support for. If there was World War III, Congress would vote to fund it. The Fed would support the spending, and then you would have, people willing to be drafted to go and do it. But this war isn't like that. This war hasn't been legitimated in all of those ways to all of those institutions. It's been pitched as something that can be done quickly and relatively cheaply. And therefore, it has to be fought within certain limited constraints.
Right. And if it started to escalate out of control, things would change. If for whatever reason, let's say it turns out that Iran had a nuclear missile, then
there's all this talk. Wars don't just escalate out of control. If you look at all the Cold War entanglements that the United States has been in, the war doesn't just escalate out of control.
Right.
Take Vietnam. The whole time we were in Vietnam, nobody ever sent ground troops into North Vietnam.
Right.
There was never a large-scale U.S. invasion of North Vietnam. Why was that? Because it was presumed that China would respond by coming into the war, and this would make it too expensive and too costly to fight, as had been the case in Korea. So the whole time in Vietnam, the United States operated from the premise that you can't solve any problems by sending ground troops into North Vietnam, because then you'll turn it into Korea. And if you turn it into Korea, it will be a political disaster. Now, people think of Vietnam as a political disaster, but they forget what the Korean War did to Harry Truman.
Right.
The Korean War did things to Harry Truman that Vietnam could never do to Richard Nixon, or even Lyndon Johnson for that matter. Right? Because not Herbert Hoover, excuse me.
Harry Truman. Truman.
No, 68. The Democrat. The VP.
McGovern.
No, not McGovern.
No, that was 72. Yeah.
Jeez, I'm having a senior moment.
Was it Wallace? No, who was it?
No. Humphrey.
Humphrey, right.
Yeah. Humphrey very nearly won the 68 election. It's not like the Democrats weren't competitive in 68. And many political scientists maintain that if Johnson had just stuck it out instead of quitting, that he could have won in 68 and would have been more likely to win than Humphrey. That his quitting was an admission that things were out of control, which weakened Humphrey's candidacy. And if he had not made this admission, he possibly could have seen off Nixon in 68. The Vietnam War never did the kind of political damage electorally that Korea did to Truman. So the whole time Vietnam was fought on the premise that you don't want to turn it into Korea. And because it was fought on the premise that you can't turn it into Korea, there were all sorts of military strategies and tactics that this excluded. There were plenty of military general staff people who said, no, we should do this. We should have finished the thing in Korea. MacArthur was right all along in Korea, and we should have kept going with MacArthur's strategy of trying to roll back the Chinese. But by that point, our government was committed to a containment strategy rather than rollback, and therefore it was not looking to get into an entanglement with China in Vietnam that would be very unpopular at home and cause terribly electoral consequences. Eisenhower got in on ending that war, ending it.
Right.
So, there hasn't been a total war fought by the United States with all of its capability since World War II. There have been a variety of limited wars. And when American presidents attempt to exceed the limits imposed by what the American public will bear, it becomes an extremely difficult thing for them to overcome or deal with politically. They start losing congressional elections, their poll numbers tank, their domestic agenda gets ground into dust. They all know this. They all know this.
This is what happened to a degree to Bush around Iraq.
Yes.
I mean, we are basically, the constraint on Trump here is that he will not fight this war the way that Bush fought in Iraq.
Right. Just like they wouldn't fight Vietnam the way they fought Korea. They will not fight this war the way they fought Iraq. They know that the way that they fought Iraq was a political disaster. And so it can't even escalate to that point, let alone in the kinds of directions that people are suggesting. If ground troops were to be used, it would have to be non-American ground troops. And they have struggled to motivate anybody so far to supply ground troops from any of the neighboring states.
Right. I mean, right now, there are some troops being sent to possibly try to secure the coast of
Yeah,
the strait,
the-
or possibly to
The
take
5,000 troops that might, seize Karg Island. We're not talking about an invasion force for Iran.
No, I know.
There are 50,000 troops. I'm just saying for the audience, 50,000 troops already deployed to the Middle East, right? At all of those different military bases. 5 is not a huge deployment of American forces to the Middle East.
No.
But it was reported and discussed by these jokers on the internet as if, oh, this is an invasion force. These people have no notion of even how many soldiers it takes to do anything. And if they do have a notion of how many soldiers it takes to do something, then they're deliberately lying to their viewers and exaggerating the significance of the move for the purpose of pushing their political line. So either they're ignorant or they're deliberately manipulative with the way that they cover this.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that some people might make an argument that I've heard lots of times that, it starts with some advisors or a small set of special forces, and then from there, it like a slippery slope argument of
a story about Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. A story which assumes Vietnam. But Vietnam is a very weird situation because you have a deployment to South Vietnam, but you can't deploy into North Vietnam. The North Vietnamese can send any number of insurgents down into South Vietnam, but you can never go into North Vietnam. And the only way that you can go after the North Vietnamese in North Vietnam is to dumb bomb them with a Cold War Air Force and just drop an enormous amount of stupid bombs and stupid chemicals all over the place. This is not in any way, shape, or form how any conflict today is or will be fought.
Right. Okay, so that's out of the way. I mean, I totally agree. And if I've learned one thing from this conflict, is that this is not the Gulf War, which was, the conflict that got me out in the street the first time when I was 21 years old or 20 years old or whatever, and where we had these Patriot missiles that were supposedly precision bombs that weren't, right? And so now
we still have those.
Right, I know, but now whatever we're using is a bit better, quite a bit better.
Yeah, there's other stuff that's more precise. That doesn't mean that it always hits its target. That doesn't mean that it doesn't kill civilians, but in the dialectic of precision, more precise. And the intelligence at this point permits a level of targeting that was previously not possible. Now, all that said, there seems to be some trouble finding the new supreme leader. He seems to be holed up pretty good.
Yeah, wherever he is, whether it's
wherever he is. The cost of holding him up might be that he's not able to be functionally in charge. If you don't have information because you're holed up so tight, you have no internet because you're concerned that anything that's the internet could lead to somebody targeting your location. They've cut the internet in the country because they know that an enormous amount of devices and cameras, even on the streets of Tehran, are or were hacked by the Israelis. And that's why the internet is not running in the country. It's not because necessarily they need to cut the internet to prevent people from organizing to get out. It's because at this point, it's dangerous for people in the regime to be online. Because the internet is just as likely to enable them to be found and targeted as making a physical appearance with their body.
Now, okay, so I want to talk about this from a different angle and to kind of go back to the strait. I mean, you're saying that maybe the goal is not to open up the strait, but I think that eventually, within a month or two, there's going to definitely be enough international pressure to make
I think they're open to opening up the strait. The administration is open to opening it, but I don't think the administration is committed to it to the same degree that a lot of people watching think that the administration is committed to it, because people watching think that if the strait doesn't open, it will obviously create a 70s style oil shock, which is not the case.
Well, there's an oil shock. Yeah, I mean, the markets are so interconnected now that an oil shock that really hurts Europe on the level of consumption will hurt the United States on the level of investment.
Some, But we
Yeah.
saw in 2022, it's not devastating to the United States to have $120 a barrel oil for a period of time. It doesn't devastate the US economy. It's a speed bump. It caused 2022 to be a weaker year than it otherwise would have been, but it doesn't produce a politically lethal shock.
Right. Right. And yeah, but there are some people who worry, and I think I've read this in the Wall Street Journal, at least a headline from the Wall Street Journal, maybe it was somewhere else, but that because so much of the U.S. economy is invested in the development of AI, or these large language models, or whatever the hell this stuff really is, right? And these data centers, which and because those are so consumptive in terms of energy and electricity, that there is a vulnerability to the United States from even a more minor shock, or at least that the 2022 level shock might have some detrimental effect over the whole of the U.S. economy, because the bottom would fall out. Basically the bubble will burst
Well, if you're talking about
prematurely.
electrical generation, the bulk of American electrical generation doesn't have much to do with the crude oil price.
Right.
If we're talking about electrical generation,
what generates most of our electricity?
we have a significant amount that's shale oil. We have a significant amount that's legacy coal. We have a significant amount that's nuclear. We have a relatively diverse grid. I'm not really persuaded by all of that. Also, if you had that kind of thing, if it was an investment related shock, then you could just drop the interest rate, and that would alleviate the pressure on a lot of these guys, in terms of their borrowing costs.
Which is possible, which is completely in the cards,
Right. If it's that kind of shock, that's the kind of shock that you can, reduce the interest rate to potentially get some space on. The issue is if you get inflation in the United States, real inflation, it would make it very difficult then to do a rate cut at the same time. So the thing to watch is the inflation number. The inflation number could really spell a difficult situation.
But that's
happen.
That's tied to the price of oil to a degree.
To a degree, but not as much as it used to be. The U.S. inflation rate is not as much tied to what happens with the Middle East oil as was the case in the 70s. Because at this point, it's a very different kind of energy economy.
Yeah. Someone asks, what about about how it affects food prices and also fertilizer?
It affects that principally for poorer states. Poorer states, when the price goes up, get priced out of a lot of this stuff and end up in very bad situations. So one of the effects of this could be famine, real famine in Asian countries, in African countries, extreme, serious poverty. And then you combine this with some of the U.S. aid cuts, you could have very bad situations in some African states in terms of food scarcity. However, Americans are going to be able to buy that stuff. If you have a tightening up of the price market, the rich countries always buy that stuff, and they're not going to have a supply disruption. Certainly not. A country like the United States produces an enormous amount of food, is not dependent on food imports from countries in Asia. That's not going to be a problem that's felt in the United States. And the reason I'm emphasizing the United States is not because I care about the Americans and don't care about people in the developing countries. It's not about me caring. It's about, if you're thinking about what could cause the war to end, it's got to be political pressure in the United States that would cause Trump to pull out or back off or to stop going through with this. It's not going to be something that's done on the basis of food scarcity issues in other parts of the world. Joe Biden went ahead with the Ukraine war. It impoverished people in Asia. It impoverished people in Africa. People in Sri Lanka, in large numbers, died of starvation. The American president did nothing about it. The media in the United States didn't cover it. Nobody cared. Nobody did anything. Nobody on the left talked about it.
No, it might be, if there was a real severe famine that we could hear about, might do the left some good, right? We could get another version of We Are the World or Live Aid going. But in
practice, you can't actually hold the American public's attention with hey, did you know that the rate of kids coming to classrooms in Sri Lanka who are malnourished or underweight is, double the percentage that it was a year ago because nobody in Sri Lanka can buy grain? That's something that doesn't get substantial media coverage in the United States, and which American citizens have proven repeatedly that they don't care about.
I was real cynical just a moment ago, but I think we should pause there for a moment, because the way in which this is being discussed on the supposed left, because of the anti-imperialist frame and the wish fulfillment approach, like, oh, this is going to be the end for Israel, this is going to be the end for the United States, that narrative kind of blinds us to other forms of critique. Like, what is this doing for your typical American, even, let alone what is it doing for the working class around the world, or to them? And what about the Iranians themselves? Like, what is the likelihood that anything good is going to come out of this for the Iranian movement that was attempting to break free from the regime just a month or so ago?
Yeah, the problem is that a lot of these people are at this point defending the regime on the grounds that it's anti-American, and they're doing their Brickster fantasy where all of the regimes that are anti-American are joined in some fantasy Cold War bloc that doesn't exist. They're not engaging with what's really going on. And their notion of what goes on in these countries is based on propaganda influencer accounts where people go through, Beijing or Shanghai or Moscow and show you the subway systems and look how clean everything is. This is not, we're not dealing with people who are actually serious about trying to understand what's happening. And we're not dealing with people who are actually serious about improving the standard of living for people in different parts of the world.
Right. Yeah. Or, they're not interested in that, and they're not interested in organizing for substantial political change.
Never mind even that. Of course not that. But even what's the standard of living in Sri Lanka? Nobody cares. I
interviewed Blumenthal once from the Gray Zone, Blumenthal's kid. And at the end of the interview, I said to him, well, what do you think if your fantasy version of this comes true, what do you think the likelihood is that anything's going to improve? Don't you think that you're looking at a situation where there'll be more international conflict and possibly more poverty and more oppression, even if the United States and Israel are also suffering under the new regimes? And he said, really, that's not my problem. I'm not here to try to prescribe how to make social change or political change happen. I'm a critic of Israel and the United States.
We're talking about records. We're talking about records. And that's been the problem with the left for a long time. It's a bunch of wreckers who want to see a mess.
Right. But I think a lot of people who engage in this don't think of them, aren't quite aware of what they're going along with, maybe. I hate to say that, because I tend not to want to psychologize people or accuse everyone of acting in bad faith, or accuse people of being useful idiots or anything like that, right? But I do think there are a lot of people who, especially younger people,
a lot of it's that people feel like they have no possibility of making political change in the country that they live in, so they place hope or faith in people in some other part of the world, in a place that they don't properly understand, where they don't speak the language, they don't really know what the internal conversation is. And people do this because they are stressed out and they are feeling impotent. I understand and sympathize to a large degree with the various kinds of things that cause people to do this. It's just, I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And I'm trying to have good conversations about what's going on with people who are mentally healthy enough to do that. And these left-wing people who pretend to be reporting on what's going on, or pretend to be trying to participate in a real conversation about what's taking place, these people are not actually engaged in the kind of activity I'm engaged in. And yet people are always trying to make me pay attention to what they're doing. They're making entertainment content for a group of disaffected people who are upset because they can't change America, they can't change Europe, they can't change the countries that they live in. They're hoping that someone somewhere else in the world is doing what they can't do. They've bought into third worldist fantasies of revolution coming from the poorest and weakest parts of the world. So, we're not engaged in the same activity fundamentally.
Yeah, I want to point this out. I know I'm kind of harping on something you'd like to move away from. Somebody says calling anti-imperialist wreckers is pretty weak, and I want to respond to that just by saying, you know, it's only weak if you don't listen to the reasoning or take into account the reasoning behind the claim. It's not so much that he's simply causing or calling these people a bad name, but he's pointing out how there's no effort to build a serious political movement that could actually do
There's
something
no
to
positive
alleviate.
vision. You know,
Right.
this is similar to the critique I've made many times of anarchism. People who, or, resistance, anti stuff. This is not a politics. There's no substantive political project, and therefore no substantive strategy for trying to achieve that project. It's hostility to the project that seems to be continuing to advance despite attempts to resist it or negate it.
Mm-hmm.
And resisting and negating isn't good enough. You have to convince people that there's actually an alternative, a real alternative, a positive alternative, a future to believe in, things
Mm-hmm.
that Bernie Sanders used to at least talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're at a point where nobody's got any kind of future to believe in. The future seems to have been canceled, and people are just cheering for the thing to fall apart in various ways.
Right. And look,
that's not a solution.
this is, and what I'll say is that the older guy here is that this is not new. This does feel to me like a repeat. I feel like I'm back where I was when I came in the podcasting scene. There's dysfunction happening that, and an unseriousness. I mean, I saw J. Michael Greer on Unheard, who, I have nothing against personally, but he's a druid or something who believes in some kind of redefined magic. And they're asking him what's going to happen to Donald Trump on Unheard. And I just remembered that when I first started podcasting, J. Michael Greer was on a podcast that I knew the podcast host, it's KMO, friend of mine. And he was just some guy in his truck who was interested in peak oil theories, talked to Howard Kunstler a lot, was a libertarian, not a leftist, and had an interest in kind of psychedelic spirituality. And, and that was, and now, Unheard, which is supposedly a more serious political venture, is in the same space. So, I'm indicting myself to a degree because that's where I kind of come from. But nonetheless, it does seem odd that we're back at that moment.
Yeah, and in some ways, it's the death of the millennial left, which I
Right.
think we need to take more seriously. If the millennial left is dead, then there's nothing to imminently critique there. And so what we do doesn't have to be continuously in dialogue with this decrepit, rotting corpse that isn't doing anything constructive, that has at this point become a place where mentally ill people hang out and comfort each other. We're really not talking about something that you can substantively argue with. It's a cope. And this has been going on for years. And I've been saying for years that it's a cope in various ways in my writing. And, people can look at The Way Is Shut and all of that. I don't understand why we have to spend our whole lives in dialogue with this manifestly unserious stuff that is not going to do anything for anybody. I would like us to instead think about together what we can do that would be a new response, something new, something different, something that takes into account the actual conditions that exist now, as opposed to various historical analogies that fantasize about things being like the way they were 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 or 100 or 150 years ago.
It does put us in a difficult spot, though, because, I agree with you. Fundamentally, I agree with you. But, when something like this attack on Iran happens, there's a certain natural expectation that people like you and I will have something of substance to say about it. And the things that I've been saying about it, and certainly the things that you've been saying about it, are counterintuitive to a lot of people who would be turning to us right now. And to refuse to even address it seems like an abdication.
That's because we're still too much associated with that rotting corpse.
Okay. Say a little more.
We're still too much. Think about what the Sublation Media Project is often trying to enter into. It's often trying to enter into left-wing debates with the various left-wing influencers who are the vestigial remnants of what was once the millennial left, who've regressed into various things that everyone recognizes as debased, dead, 70s projects or 2000s projects.
I started before it was obvious that there was a millennial left. Just to be,
yeah. In your case, yeah. But so like where we're at now.
Well, I just think of it still as like the same basic left that I was engaging with in 2009, and often enough they're the same players that are still around. Like someone like Jody Dean or Doug Henwood or people like that. I mean, although I talk to those kinds of people less and less all the time, but nonetheless, like I still try to track where that left has gone, and I definitely one thing I have to accept is that it is now a different generation. It's a millennial generation who've taken up the mantle, even though they might bring those people on their shows. It is a dead millennial left that's really absorbed.
I can't be intellectually constrained by having to continuously engage with the concepts of these people, because these concepts are too poor quality to be intellectually generative to be engaging with. And they're never going to, at this point, if you're still engaged in this kind of behavior in 2026, and I've said this every year, and we could argue over what's the year where anybody who's over a certain age would have realized that this isn't going anywhere.
I think 2020.
Maybe 2020, maybe 2018. There's a period of reasonable denial where you're going, it seems like it's screwed, but I still want to try to save it. And then there's the year where everybody would have to accept it. People would argue about where that is, but nobody would say that, it's now or 2025 or 2024 or 3 or 2. I think, it would be 2020 or 2021 at the latest.
But as someone here's the other problem I have hearing what you're saying. On the one hand, I agree with you about the state of the millennial left, but on the other hand, having been a lifelong leftist who's been a degenerate at times myself, I am reluctant to give up the overall project of what I consider to be left socialism. And so when I want to critique something, I don't feel very excited about the prospect of critiquing, say, a centrist Democrat or Mitt Romney.
I don't think we should be, critiquing the nationalists. I'm not a nationalist. I don't think that the nation state can solve any of these problems. I think the nation state is at the root of a lot of the trouble.
Right.
But also equally, this kind of third worldist anarchist stuff is not in any way, shape, or form something that can be constructively critiqued. What we need is to begin building up a way of talking about this stuff, which is in dialogue with actual conditions, which you've tried to do under the banner of realism to some degree. But oftentimes people think of realism and socialism as necessarily opposed or in conflict, particularly at the level of IR. We need to start finding a way to put some of these things together. Yeah, we're trying to do socialism, but we're trying to do socialism in a way that's in dialogue with things like realism and maybe with other things too. And therefore, some of this, this stuff which involves nationalism or it involves anarchism has to be excluded from what we're doing and not so much the focus of our engagement.
Yeah, I agree. But let's table that for a moment. And so I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal, Ben. Next week, I won't bring up anything I saw on Twitter. Okay. That's my pledge to you. But what I do think we should ask is what opportunities are there in this moment for some sort of effort to connect a liberatory, emancipatory project to everyday people in, say, the United States or in Europe? Where are there opportunities for beginning to try again, do you think?
Well, I think the thing that I would be focusing on, if I could control what we were all talking about for a minute, the thing that I would be focusing on is the fact that the European allies are being asked to pony up all of this, military money. And there's no opportunity for these European allies to develop any kind of political say about this. Our friends who live in Europe and who live in the Middle East and who live in other parts of the world are being pressed into ponying up all of this money, and they have no political say over any of it. And no one is making the demand that they have political say over it. Effectively, taxation without representation is what is occurring through the alliance framework.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who should have a political say, and there should be a political institution that exists that gives them a meaningful say over the way in which these resources are deployed. Because what the United States is doing is making you buy weapons and then creating situations where you're forced to use them, and then making you buy more weapons. And you have no say over whether you buy them, and you have no say over whether the situation happens in which you have to use them.
I might be having some internet problems on my side because you disappeared for a second and I disappeared for a second.
Sorry.
So I'm not sure. No, I think it's on my side. But listen, so right, from what I heard of you, what you said is that we should try to organize around the idea that the people who are running the world aren't representing our interests, whether it's in Europe or in the United States. And I do think that would lead to a pretty traditional approach to running an anti-war movement. And one of the things that you could say is like, why are both parties spending all this money to run these phony wars? Where that don't have to. Why is politics leading to this kind of barbaric approaches to diplomacy? Because this is the way you describe it. These limited wars are not existential. They're not forced upon anyone, right? They're a choice that's being made to operate at this level. So why is that allowed? Why can't we constrain?
And there's a false narrative that these allies are doing this military spending to have independence from the United States. That's not the case. They've been forced and disciplined into doing this military spending by the United States and by the foreign policy crises that the United States has created in proximity to them. The allies are getting really badly abused right now. They're really getting badly mistreated. And the people who live in these countries think that national sovereignty allows them to chart an independent course. It doesn't. It makes them weak and has allowed them to be subordinated. There's an opportunity to criticize nationalism, criticize the nation state as a project on the basis of how is the nation state in the Middle East and in Europe weakening the various people who live in these places, depriving them of any say over what is done with their resources, with the output of their labor. But this is not at all broached. Instead, many people on the left encourage the military spending because they believe, stupidly, that this is going to somehow increase the sovereign autonomy of these states when they're doing this military spending through the framework of NATO, and when, in response to the United States kicking off a crisis in Ukraine or kicking off a crisis in Iran, these states immediately begin deferentially using their interceptors, sending their weapons to the Ukrainians. And not only do they do that, they beg the United States to stay engaged and get the job done and sort the situation out. These countries are not independent in any meaningful sense.
What do you think about the way Trump asked NATO allies to join in the Strait? It was refused initially.
Yeah, and what a fake display of autonomy that was. And the left cheering on the Spaniards as if the Spaniards have shown that they have national sovereignty. What a ridiculous nationalist,
within days,
understanding of that.
And within 3 days, there was a coalition of the willing from all these NATO states saying that they were going to commit to securing the Strait, and we'll see what becomes necessary. But if you listen to what Trump said, it was pretty brutal. It was like, you guys,
they've said that they'll secure the Strait once the fighting stops. Once the fighting stops and there's some sort of settlement, then they'll come and they'll help at that point.
I think it's maybe I've looked into this. I think you're kind of right, but I think that it's sort of unclear. It's what they'll do, because on the one hand, that was Macron's original statement on the 17th, and then on the 19th there was a statement from the EU and then there have been statements since then up till today. And I think it's unclear as to what they would be willing to do. But I do think that I think maybe it will require the United States and Israel to pause the bombing campaign, but they will be willing to face Iranian drones and attacks while they try to secure the strait.
If there are rogue elements that would violate the terms of a ceasefire or something, but there would have to be some understanding that there was a general cessation, and so any attacks on their ships would be exceptions to that. They're not going to go in at a point where the Iranians are dedicated to stopping them, because then what's going to happen is they're going to deplete their interceptors, and then they're going to end up on the hook having to buy more of these things.
Yeah,
build more of these things.
I just think that they're going to end up having to swallow that, but we'll see.
Maybe, and if that happens, what a tragedy that these countries don't have any ability to actually chart a course. People who say they want to have some control over what's done with their resources have to recognize that nationalism and national sovereignty in no way gives you that. And the anti-imperialists who are obsessed with national liberation have failed to recognize that in the world that has been constructed post-World War II, that's a chimera. You don't accomplish anything by creating an independent, tiny little state that can then be bullied economically by everybody. That's not any kind of meaningful autonomy. And this critique, no one makes it because the horizon is so low that people just put flags in their profiles and cheer on nation states to defeat the United States.
Right.
Like they're, having dogs fight or roosters fight in a backyard and betting on it. And a lot of them probably do bet on it through Kalshi or whatever other prediction market.
Oh no, there's
a whole sick charade that we're in.
You can bet on it directly through Polymarket. I think there are ways.
I'm sure you can. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in the influencer space who make all kinds of bets on these prediction markets about all of this stuff. But what's really needed is a proper internationalism, which recognizes the ways in which the nation state doesn't actually deliver on the autonomy, the control, the freedom that it purports to deliver on for the people who live in these countries. You don't get anything out of having an independent nation state.
Well, I want to say this, and then we should wrap it up and take a break and maybe meet again in 10 minutes for another round if you have time for that. I just want to say that, and I'm as guilty of this as others in a way. Getting it right now, meaning making a prediction, placing your bet, and seeing, if you win, it's not going to help much. And I would also say to those people who are making bets based on the information they're getting from the gray zone are going to lose, $10, $20, $100, whatever they're betting, it's likely anyway. And actually, I talked to someone on Twitter who told me that they had put a significant amount of money into oil futures on the basis of the assumption that the strait was going to be closed for a year and go up to $200 or $150 or something a barrel. And I was just like, really
don't do this stuff, guys. People who study this stuff for a living full time don't know what's going to happen. Don't make stupid bets based on what YouTubers and influencers on TikTok and Instagram and God knows where else tell you. Including me. Don't make bets based on things I say. Don't lose your money.
Yeah, no. If I would give you any advice, it would be wrong. But I would say put it in gold. But that's wrong too. Apparently gold went down. I don't even know what to tell people to do. But
we're not running a financial advice show, thank God.
Although we would make a lot of money if we did, Ben. The YouTube algorithm would reward us with better ads. Anyway, we're not doing that. And I'm not going to put financial advice in the tags for this video, despite what we did here at the end. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. I also want to tell everyone in the chat that I do not have any tattoos, not an anarchy tattoo, and not whatever else. Somebody asked me if I had a Hulk Hogan tattoo. No. And oil is at 90 a barrel. We'll end it there. And in 10 minutes or so, we'll see you in the Parrot Room on Patreon. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.